I've been invited here to talk about how the Dementia Enquirers work has shaped or could shape the work of NHS researchers. So as part of that, I have been very lucky to be joined by the lovely Winnie, who, give us all a lovely little wave, who is one of the partners in research, which is essentially based on the Dementia Enquirers model, and it is the patient and public involvement group for the Neuroprogressive and Dementia Network in Scotland. So essentially the network that covers dementia research across Scotland, it's the patient and public involvement group. So Dementia Enquirers, which I know some of you will know about, but some might not, is essentially almost a response to the fact that a lot of people with lived experience of dementia felt that their views or the issues that they were coming across were not being put at the front of people's minds, certainly researchers' minds, and it was being led by what researchers wanted to do, not necessarily what people with dementia wanted to see the answers to. So Dementia Enquirers came along, thanks to Vinnie and Rachael in particular, and we were able to have pioneers, so people living with dementia, who helped to decide on research projects that were led by people with lived experience. So there's lots of information about that I won't go into too much detail on, and we can show the shiny pack at the end that has more information. And I think there's a link we can put in the chat box for the different publications that come from that. But essentially, it's a model about changing the power dynamics between people with lived experience and researchers to make sure that we're doing what we can to value that lived experience. So from that, I have been very lucky to be supported to implement this type of model into patient and public involvement in NHS Scotland. So the network had previously had what's called a PPI group. It's a horrible acronym, but PPI group. But it was not having any kind of dedicated time that was focused on that involvement and what people wanted from that involvement. So after working with Dementia Enquirers, I was able to start looking at how we could integrate a similar model within the NHS. And people with lived experience were invited to take part and build a network of things that we wanted to see coming out of both research and research-related activities. So that being said, I was going to pass, first of all, to Winnie to introduce yourself, Winnie, and just say a little bit about why you got involved in this type of work, if that's okay.
Hi, everybody. My name is Winnie Henry, and I got involved with Partners in Research because my husband had dementia. He had vascular dementia. And I found that I didn't have a voice. No, I had the lived experience. I was the one who was dealing with it 24/7, but nobody would give me credit for that. And that was what made me think, Partners in Research, get in here and find out exactly what I can do. And I've never regretted it, never looked back.
That's on recording now, Winnie, and I can say, look, you didn't regret it. It's so good. But it's a big part of changing how we interact with people and the learning in terms of how we involve the NHS. So part of the challenge, I think, is that the NHS model around dementia has often been very biomedical, we'd call it. So very focused on the kind of what's going on in the brain as opposed to maybe what's going on for the whole person. And by involving people with lived experience, we start to kind of say, well, what does the whole person want and need? And particularly to recognize people as experts in their own experience. And that's something that's been largely missing. So as well as the kind of user-led, what do you want to see from research? Part of our role is to look at how we can make research materials more accessible and research information more accessible. And again, you'll see in the delightful packs information on how we talk about dementia, how we report about dementia, and how we put this information together. And a lot of that has led to the way we do communications within the NHS in terms of how do we make this very medical knowledge a lot more accessible for people to understand. So one of the things that Winnie and myself were involved in is creating a book about people's lived experience, because I think something that both Dementia Enquirers and Partners in Research has shown is that firstly, people want to get their story across. They want to have their voices heard. As Winnie said, you don't feel like your voice is being listened to, and you need an opportunity for that to happen before we start getting involved in what could research look like and where do we go with that. First of all, you need to have your story heard. You need to, you know, have people know what you've been through, and not just you individually, Winnie, but also you wanted to make sure your husband's story was shared and that people could learn from the experiences you've had. So an experience that I know from being around the Dementia Enquirers, and I know from Winnie, when you've spoken about it, is this idea of somebody not looking like they have dementia, and someone, you know, having what's seen as a normal conversation and then saying, well, they seemed fine to me, so I don't know what you're on about. And that's something that I think when you're trying to deal with getting a diagnosis and you're trying to listen to, say, NHS professionals about your diagnosis, that can be very difficult and confusing to have that mixed information to what's going on in the NHS versus what's going on the ground. So Winnie, would you be up for sharing a bit about some of your experiences you've had with NHS research or NHS professionals? And we can talk a bit about how we'd like to see that change based on the work we're doing. Is that all right?
Yes, that's fine. My husband had complex needs. He had something wrong with his heart. He had diabetes. He had quite a lot of things going on, as well as the dementia. And he was always very upfront about his dementia. He knew he had it, and he would say to people, I've got dementia. It doesn't mean that I'm stupid. You can still talk to me, you can still ask me questions. And if I forget what you've asked me, then you can ask me again. And that was his ethos, that was the way he went on. But when we went into hospital, they would ignore him and ask me questions. And he would say to me, he'd say, do you realise they spoke to you and not to me? Why are they doing that? They didn't give him his place. They didn't make him feel as though he had a right to ask anything. And that went on constantly. There was one, every winter he was in hospital, but there was one time in particular he went in, and he was really, really frustrated that they wouldn't listen to him. He knew what he wanted. He was, as he said, I'm of sound mind. The mind's just a wee bit kind of poorly, just the same as my body's poorly. But they certainly would not listen, and they wouldn't listen to me. I had power of attorney. That didn't make any difference to them, I would say, but you know, if he had this and this done, he would be more comfortable if he was in a quiet room, if there weren't the overhead lights, which really agitated him. He would do a lot better, because he would kick off, he would get annoyed, but he was annoyed and frustrated because they wouldn't listen. You know, and that was one of the most difficult times. I think nobody would listen to him. Nobody would listen to me. And I was the one who was nursing him 24/7. So I knew exactly what he needed, but it was, who are you? What do you know? We are the professionals. I'm sorry, but in that case, they really didn't know what was going on.
Thank you, Winnie. And I think, unfortunately, I'd love to say that, you know, that's a one-off example, but we know that that's not the case. And we know that often people feel that their lived experience is not being recognised. And I think this is a huge challenge in terms of how we implement things like the learning from dementia inquirers into the NHS and things like partners in research into the NHS. Is firstly, we have to make sure people are willing to accept people's experience and expertise as kind of valid knowledge and valid information. And part of the challenge is that in terms of NHS practice, rightly, we go for what's known as an evidence-based approach. So can we show that what's the best thing, that if you repeat it numbers of times, you get the same consistent result? That's the thing you want to use. What we're finding with things like user-led research where people with lived experience have either come up with a question or designed the research or been involved in the research, is actually there are now more and more ways to create credible evidence that can then be used in the NHS. Because I think there is a bit of a gap that actually a lot of this work around this more collaborative approach can start to fill, where we recognise that evidence is important. We know that evidence is important. We can't just say, well, we'll take everyone at their word. But what we can say is we will listen to people and learn from those experiences to then apply that into practice. And I know that when people like Winnie have worked in our kind of collaborative groups with other people with lived experience, we've come away with some common themes around things that people have experienced. So there's both that sense of, if you've met one person with dementia, you've met one person with dementia, but equally we can learn from each other as a group in terms of how we apply that into the NHS. Another big barrier, probably one of the biggest barriers, I think, in terms of implementing the learning from the Dementia Enquirers, and also some of the work that we've been trying to do as partners in research, is tackling the research ethics committee issues around ethics. So there are very rightly huge research ethics councils across the UK that NHS researchers have to apply to, and research where you're involving people who are classed as patients or service users need to go through. Now, one of the big challenges is that we know that a lot of these processes are not accessible, and that the information created in these processes, like consent forms, are often hard to understand, and really it's very hard to give informed consent given the way it's presented. So it's not that you can't understand what you need from consent, it's the information presented with you clashes with that. Funnily enough, we've had a lovely example of this, I think just yesterday, when it came to media consent forms and the accessibility of being able to print those off and sign those. And this is a clear problem, that if we want to truly make sure people are informed, we need to make sure that the information and the way it's provided is in an accessible way. And we are still dealing with things like, how do you make sure that things like consent, we did a consent form process as part of ethics for book writing, and we made sure the forms were co-created, and we had them all beautifully developed and everyone signed them. And then we were told we need to do the official forms that don't make any sense and that are hard to access, and there's lots of problems with this. So I think there's definitely a way to go around how do we encourage research ethics committees to start integrating the principles that are outlined in things like the gold standards that the Dementia Enquirers have created. It might not be that it's instead of, but bringing these two things together and making sure that you're using the expertise across the two assessments, I think, is a really important part of what we do. And sharing that expertise, because, you know, as in situations I know you shared, Winnie, it's not just that you're saying, I don't believe in the medicine, I don't believe in the science. It's saying, let's work together on how to make the best of a situation that can often be very difficult. And I think that's where the Dementia Enquirers had things like advisors. So that's how I got involved right at the start, was as an advisor to the Dementia Enquirers, where you get to sit in the background and drink in all of the enthusiasm of the group and all of the excitement of the group, but just be there if and when you're needed, rather than it being kind of about you or your experience as a researcher. It's about saying, how do we work? And I think the term that's been used now is the scaffolding, and so how do we support people in that way, that we're there as help, but recognizing that your role is to support other people in doing research using your research skills. And I think that's somewhere where we've still got a way to go in recognizing that everyone's bringing different expertise to the table. So in the same way as recognizing people's lived experience of dementia, as researchers, we get to go, okay, here's what we can help you with. We've got lots of training in research design and development, so let's work together to make something that works well for both of us. And hopefully that makes the learning apply to practice more. So again, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, Winnie, because we were talking a bit the other day about how one of the things you find very difficult is that we talk about some of these things and how it could improve practice and how applying these approaches could help people learn, but we're not necessarily seeing that change in practice when it comes to being involved in the NHS. Is there anything you wanted to add about that?
Yes, I belong to a carers group as well, a local carers group. I'm part of the scaffolding that you were talking about now. But a lady brought to the group that she went to the hospital. She's very enthusiastic and really, really tries to make a difference. And she went to our local hospital and suggested to them that they should have a quiet room in the NHS, in the accident emergency part, so that someone coming in with their carer, with dementia, was in the quiet room until they were triaged, rather than out in a noisy waiting room, again with always at strip lights. They seem to be a big problem, and the noise, not knowing where they were, and getting more and more confused. And it seemed a great idea, and it was taken on board. They actually got funding for it. They got £10,000 funding, and then COVID struck. And of course, everything just grinded to a halt. But the lady went again to see what was happening. The NHS is starting to open up. What's happening to the quiet room? The funding's there, but it's at the bottom of our list of priorities, and they haven't even started it yet. So it's there. In fact, NDCAN has asked me to be responsible for rolling it out in every hospital locally as soon as things really pick up. We know that they're under fire just now, and you really can't expect it. But they had 2 years there where they could have got that room underway. It's all good ideas, but the good ideas are not being implemented.
Absolutely, and it's great to see that, you know, there is at least recognition that that idea is very important. But I think we do have this, not necessarily even just post-COVID challenge, but this challenge of people feeling under a lot of work strain and a lot of work pressure, and not having space to consider change in practice and implementing new things, because for the process of taking on that change, that is going to take additional work in whatever way that looks like. And I think it's very hard when we talk a lot about fighting fires, to focus on what caused the fire if they're just trying to put the fire out in all these different places. And I think there are a lot of places within the NHS that certainly feel that pressure, and I think we've seen that in the kind of wider society around what's going on there. And I think a big challenge for someone like myself, who's both a researcher within the NHS but has a lot of involvement in kind of third sector organisations and co-production groups, is how do we try and make it as easy as possible for people to take on this approach, because the easier we can make it, hopefully the more likely it is to be taken on. And I think a huge part of that, excuse me, I think a huge part of that is recognising that people are fighting fires and doing the best they can. Because I think sometimes when we talk about things like service change or implementing new ideas, people see it as you're doing your job badly, or a kind of threat to the way they've been doing things, or you don't understand all the things I've got going on, when really we know that that doesn't work as a model of getting change. What we need to show is we recognize that these fires are burning, and we want to say, how can we help you, while also hopefully introducing some change within that. And I think this is where the kind of next stage really of things like Dementia Enquirers is, and the learning from Dementia Enquirers that has shaped things like Partners in Research is, because we can kind of say, right, let's work together here. We know that some of these things work. We know that we can create this evidence base. How do we make it easier for you to implement that evidence base and that learning? And I think we're growing in terms of that interest and people wanting to be involved. And I think a big part of it is also people like Winnie, but people recognizing or being able to see how their involvement does create change and does raise awareness, or does start to make people think. Because if we don't have that, then also people are going to run out of steam to be involved, because you just don't feel like you're getting anywhere. And I think that's a very important part of a lot of the dementia activism that's gone on over the years, trying to get a platform, trying to be heard. And we're in a really exciting place now, I think, in terms of where we're at with this type of work, that people are starting to see where they could get their voices heard. And so more people are coming forward and sharing their stories. And it does create a ripple effect where people, I know that even just reading the individual stories we've got in the book that we've created together, you can see how that awareness is growing over time. And I've also see that Mac is on the call, and he's also a co-author of this book, which is very exciting. So it's lovely to see you here too, Mac. But I think it shows that these connections build, and it's a whole change in ethos of how we do things, and it's how we can implement the academic word I would say is the biopsychosocial model, but that how do we include a bit of everything to recognize what's going on in people's experiences. And I suppose the final question, and again I'll put to Winnie, but I suppose it's for everyone really, is what kind of research would you like to see being done in the NHS that has this more kind of user-led ethos within it, and how maybe we can overcome some of those challenges. But I'll start with the question to you, Winnie, about what would you like to see, and then we can maybe have a bit of a group discussion about what those barriers might be and what we think we could do about that. So it will give everyone a chance to have a wee bit of a chat about that. But I'll ask you first, Winnie, what would you like to see in NHS research going forward?
I'd really like to see that they use us as partners in research. I'd really like to see that they saw that our lived experience was valuable, and they used that as a model.
And hopefully this is just one part of that, because it is about sharing the learning, isn't it? And I think making sure that, I think in history we've been quite bad at, for lots of societal reasons and infrastructure reasons, at kind of keeping what we've created or what we've learned in our own little silos and not sharing that because we want to get the next bit of funding or the next bit of work. And actually I think part of what we're trying to do is say, well, let's go the other way around and share as much of our learning as possible and collaborate and work together, because that's how these ideas grow. So having things like the Dementia Enquirers research pack is, I think poor Rachael is now distributing that across every place in Scotland I can think of that might benefit from having a copy. But it acts as a starting point to that conversation. And I think it's important to know, I suppose as my kind of final point before opening up, is that there are lots of NHS professionals who want to learn more about this, who want to take on this approach. It is not necessarily, and of course there's always going to be extremes, but that they don't want to involve people with lived experience. But there's often this thing of how do we do it? How do we fit it into our current working models? But there is a lot of hope to get people involved, and there's a lot of excitement that could come from that. And I think sometimes they feel like they're in a kind of rock and a hard place because they want to help, but they're also trying to do the bits of work. But I think it's really exciting that we're in this position to start being able to say, well, actually, the Dementia Enquirers have made it easy for you, because here's a lovely starting point. And then we can hopefully collectively build on that and raise awareness of how we can work together. And I mean, there's already several projects in my head of where we can go next with this type of work. And poor Winnie and Mac are already mentally signed up to this stuff. You're not getting away from me that easily. But I think it's really exciting, and I think we're in a really nice position. So I will shush for a bit and let you guys unmute, and just wanted to ask kind of what you see as the future for the NHS staff. And I've seen Mac's got a card. You are prepared, Mac. Do you want to unmute yourself and jump in there?
Thank you. Yeah, nice to see everybody again. I've been away for 5 weeks, and yeah, new face. Maybe I met before, but everybody else I met previously and face to face. But yeah, what comes to my mind is, and I've made a couple of notes. I think the most important thing is body language, eye contact, and all that, and the gestures, the nodding of head, all that makes a difference. And and all that equals to trust. Because if you've got a condition, if you've got a hidden disability, the biggest obstacle that we face is trusting somebody, because we were talking about professionals, and let's be honest, they have not been professionals with us. You know, they haven't told us everything. They haven't been upfront with things, and they've concentrated on the person sitting next to you rather than focusing on the person that is actually part of the game. So professionally, I think we need basic understanding for them. You know, they need to understand that they all preach that if you met one person with dementia, you met one person with dementia, but they treat everybody the same. Now, when you sit in front of a professional, their treatment or their gestures and their conduct should be tailor-made to the person they're talking to. And they don't seem to do that. And if you need a topic for research, I think that is a good one to start off with, because they need basic education and they need to understand that we're all different, we're all unique, and we matter. And that's the basic, I believe, that's needed. And it should be person focused, you know. I have come across many people that have said that they were ignored. And I, at times, found it insulting and degrading. Like one professional, for instance, asked me to write something. So he gave me a pen and a paper. So I wrote something and gave it him back. And I said, you asked me to write something, and there is something, you know. So, you know, I think they should be treated, you know, or, okay, we've got a condition, but we're not loopy. We haven't lost it all up there. We're still a person. And I have been a professional all my life, and I know how to talk to professional people and at all levels. And I think that is something that the professionals need to realize and talk at their level. Having said that, they also need to come down with the language, the jargon, so that everybody can understand. Some of the medical terms that they used in their conversation might not be familiar to a normal person, let alone with somebody with a condition. So I think it's important that the basic knowledge, education, and homework on the person they're dealing with needs to be done at outset. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Mac. I think you've raised several really important points there. As Mac knows, you pointed out to me how much I nod in a meeting now, and now it's all I notice when I realize how much I nod along and then go, oh, that's me doing that. But it's a good thing. I'm okay with that. But I think you are right that, you know, and as Winnie's story showed as well, that people are often not feeling like they're talking directly to the person with lived experience. And unfortunately, a lot of kind of outdated stereotypes of what talking to somebody with lived experience of dementia is and what it looks like. And we need to challenge that stereotype of lack of ability to understand what's going on, and always assume that somebody does have an ability to understand what's going on and maybe can't communicate it always the way that you expect. But I think it's a really important point in terms of building that trust. And I think another part of building the trust is recognizing that that trust has been damaged along the way. And I think until we recognize that and recognize that people don't feel that they've been listened to, people do feel wary of the system and the way they've been treated. And I think until we can kind of say, actually, yeah, it's not been done well, we can't move forward. But I think if we end up kind of stuck in that defensive, well, we're doing the best we can, you're not giving that room for change. And finally, the jargon thing, again, is a big thing. And I think there's information about different ways of communicating in the information packs. But I think it's something that we also, again, it goes back to recognizing that somebody with dementia may want to understand the biology of what's going on. And there are ways of communicating that biology and communicating what's happening in the brain in an accessible way. It doesn't all have to be extreme terminology and language that's not going to be used in everyday conversation. There are ways of communicating it differently. So I think it's all very important points, and it is lovely to have you back. So welcome back, Mac. Are there any other questions that have come up? I realise there's been hands or comments. So on you go, Rachel.
Steve's put something in the chat box. I don't know if you can see that. Can you see that? Do you want to say it, Steve, or would you like me to? Shall I? Would you like to read it out, Steve? I'll read it out.
No, you can work away, Rachel, no problem. I thought I was muted. You work away, no bother.
Shall I do it? Okay,
Yes,
and then
please.
you can chip in. So Steve says, the question I would love to see the NHS uptake is, how do we update the general public's perception of people living with dementia? And how do we teach doctors and consultants to stop playing God with people's lives? Professional people need to listen and involve people living with dementia in their work and research. Each and every person living with dementia is different, and their skills and knowledge of the condition is unique to them.
Absolutely. I think lots of key points in there, Steve. So thank you for kind of drawing attention to that. I suppose things like this are step one, and, you know, having these conversations and opening that dialogue. But it is very difficult if we're not kind of invited into those spaces to offer that training and to make sure that people do kind of learn what they don't know. So quite recently, we had some training for some of the local psychiatrists, where we were invited in as partners in research to talk a bit about this type of involvement. But that involved somebody running the event, recognizing the importance of that, and then inviting us to be part of that training, whereas usually it's a lot of closed doors and kind of everything's done in-house and not spoken about. So I think a huge part of what we need to do in terms of, even before we start updating the general public's perception, is to make sure that the training and information people who are working in the field get is up to date and is encompassing what we've learned from these more user-led approach and approaches like patient public involvement, for want of a better phrase. And I hope that by doing more things like this, we can show that actually people do want to contribute, people do want to hear, and hopefully build up that kind of credibility of why in any kind of training or any kind of personal development thing that professionals do, we include sessions that involve people with lived experience. It is improving. We've definitely been invited to more over the last year or so than I've seen, but it needs to be the norm, and we're not there yet. And I think we do need to keep pushing for that. So thank you very much for your comments, Steve. That's really helpful.
Can you see that Evie has her hand up, Rosie?
Yes, hello, Evie, on you go.
Hi, thank you. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Sometimes I have a problem with sound, so just let me know if I drop out. But yeah, so I'm Evie. I'm from the ESRC, so the Economic and Social Research Council. So we fund economic and social research across the UK, and probably most of you might have met my colleague Eve Forrest last week at your in-person event. So I work very closely with her. She's on a day of annual leave today, so I'm here in her place. But it's been super interesting to hear everything you're saying, and really nice to meet you all. And I just wanted to sort of flag, I guess, from a research funder perspective, that this is something we are really keen to support. It's something we're really interested in. So we're really, especially within dementia research, we're really interested in involving people with lived experience of dementia and carers within research. We have a lot of barriers in terms of quite bureaucratic structures and whatnot that we work within, in terms of actually often physically, you know, getting people on grants, getting people funded and that sort of thing. But that's something that we are always harrowing down to try and improve and get through to people, because we really do appreciate the importance of involving people with lived experience in this, especially in dementia research in this instance. And I just also wanted to flag, I can put the details in the chat, but we've literally today announced an event that we're going to be running next month, which is looking at involving under-researched communities and people living with dementia in dementia research. So it's basically bringing together researchers, policymakers, people living with dementia, carers, everybody from the whole spectrum, hoping to bring people together to sort of share best practice, talk about the practicalities of involving people living with dementia and carers in research, what we can do better, how we can help to facilitate that. So yeah, it's going to be an online event, and I will put the details in the chat and whatnot. But we would really love to see some of you there if possible, and please do share with your networks. We're also looking for a few speakers and stuff, so if that's anything you're interested in, then do get in touch. I'll put the details in. But yeah, it'd be great. You've had so many good ideas today. It'd be great to share those more widely as well. So yeah, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Evie. And it's always exciting to also see, as you say, funders engaging in this idea of having this more collaborative approach, because it doesn't fit traditional models, and a lot of what we're having to do is find ways of navigating some of those barriers. And I know that something that comes up regularly is how do we support kind of, and can never say the word, and we're recording, I'm not even going to try, compensation for people getting involved. But it's a challenge because a lot of the time you're relying on either kind of petty cash or cash that's available within, say, a network to say, well, we can allocate this to things like people getting involved in a research discussion or people joining a group. But those funds aren't always marked for that. They're not. And when you're trying to do this kind of research development work and the work such as like Dementia Enquirers, we're having to kind of say, this work is so important before we go to these bigger funders to look at these bigger projects. And there is definitely a challenge of how do we make sure that we fairly compensate people being involved in those early discussions and talks about what we want to do with research. And then when you've got the NHS stuff, there is also these kind of barriers of just how money works in the system and how it's allocated and how it's released, and all these kind of practical barriers that it would be really great to see more accessible work between things like funders and the NHS, and how do we make it as easy as possible for those two big organizations to work together in releasing money to make sure that, you know, people like Steve, Winnie and Mac could all go, do you know what, we're going to join the group and talk about developing this research and be fairly compensated for that time before going on to do, say, a bigger project that, so an example is actually, Winnie, you're involved in, aren't you, in a pre-proposal co-production group that Barbara is running. Do you want to say anything about that, just being involved in that type of work, because that's in its early development stage, isn't it?
Yes, it is. We are involved just now in looking at the health of carers and how it can be supported. The carers are, as I said the other day, they're running on empty. And Rosie liked the fact that I said you can't pour from an empty jug. And that is how carers feel. They feel that absolutely there's no support out there, very little support. They want to do things for themselves. They've got needs, they want to just, in my case, it was just that I used to want to go and do a dance class, because that was what was very, very important to me all my life. And I just wanted to go to a dance class. And I used to wave my husband away on the bus to the day centre and think, oh, it's time for me. And that's part of being healthy. And that was what was missing in my life, was the fact that I couldn't do anything that was just for me. And this is part of what we're doing in this early research, is seeing what people's needs are to stay healthy and how we can support them.
Absolutely. And then those conversations and the learning from those groups will then form part of a larger project. But to do that, there has been costs for getting involved in the group and being there, costs for travel if applicable, but also costs for if you're somebody who's supporting somebody else. Are they being looked after? Do we know that anyone can join and feel that their loved one is potentially supported? So all of that involves quite a lot of early investment in an idea, not even in a wider project. Philly, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, it's just another question really for Rosie and Winnie. Given that we're talking today specifically about co-research, PPI in the NHS, I'm wondering about the whether the use of the term patient is actually quite unhelpful, given that we've heard so many stories about how when people with dementia are in the role of being a patient because they're having some treatment or they're in a hospital, they feel so disempowered. And then if we use that same term when we're talking about involvement of people. Do you feel that kind of carries through that lack of empowerment? And do you think it might be helpful if we started using another term?
I do think it would be helpful to use another term. I'm not a fan of the term patient, and I know it's come up a lot. It's why we rebranded as Partners in Research. That was a big part of, you know, where we went next, because right in the early days of this, which was only actually a year and a half ago, but when we first started it, one of the first questions is, what do you want to be referred to as? Because PPI is often associated with scam phone calls that you get from people trying to sell you some form of personal protection insurance, I think it is. And that comes to mind much more readily than patient and public involvement. But also it is about that feeling of, or lack of feeling of power, when you're in that kind of patient role and relying on a kind of more authority figure to tell you what the situation is. Whereas actually we're trying to turn that on its head and say, well, no, actually we're coming in with that equal level of expertise. It's just that what our expertise is in is different. And so we need to learn from both. And I think patient and public involvement as a term, it just reinforces that very biomedical focus that actually we're trying to move away from. But it takes practice. You know, we've been really lucky that the Neuroprogressive and Dementia Network have seen the value of taking this approach and have been very willing to put that time and energy into implementing a lot of the models that Dementia Enquirers have created. But they've also been in a system where patient is the word you've used for the last 30, 40 years for some of them. And it does take time, and it's often not meant in a kind of malicious or disempowering way. It's just out of habit. And I think one of the things we need to do is either try and break that habit and think of a better term, although I don't fully know what a better term would be other than person, which I'm also fine with. But it might also be that actually it's one of a clear example of where we need to try and make sure that the term patient is actually looked at more as a form of empowerment, not as disempowerment. And so it could go either way. I don't know which way would be best or which would be more effective. There's a similar argument about, should we change the term dementia, because dementia has so much stigma by it, but do we change it to neurocognitive impairment? Is that better? Or so there's a lot of kind of uncertainty about which way round would be most effective. Rachel, sorry, I've seen your hand up there too.
I guess it slightly leads on from that, and it's an interesting debate, isn't it? But I was thinking, as you were speaking, Winnie, about what you've just been saying about being there at the start and kind of defining the questions and the things that were important to you. And it just really resonated with me in terms of thinking about the Dementia Enquirers projects and how that's what the groups did. They came up with their own research projects based on things that were important to them, things that they spent time discussing. And a number of those projects were very directly linked to things happening in the NHS. And yeah, perhaps you might identify more as a patient if you're using an NHS service or not. So this is that just kind of linked my brain into that. But I was just thinking that you know that the life of yourself as a patient, or in the role, you know, in that relationship with the NHS, it drives particular things in life, and it's not the whole of your life, but it can be a significant part of your life when you have dementia. So a few of the projects that spring to mind, the one that Mac was involved in the Beth Johnson Foundation around the diagnostic experience and the variety of that across the country. Another group looked at annual reviews by GPs. Another group looked at the kind of invisible disability of dementia. So there was quite a range of projects that were really directly linked to the NHS. And I guess it interests me that that is a place where people with dementia do spend time. And also maybe the impact to outcome can be quicker, perhaps, in terms of that direct relationship to what I could imagine. I know I may be completely incorrect, but I could imagine that research outcomes can be implemented a little more quickly in something that's more active, like a National Health Service, compared perhaps to the way research happens in universities, where it takes a long, long time to be put into practice. So just a few little ramblings, but I was just really interested in the kind of the potential, I guess, of the relationship with the NHS and where research sits with that, but also just to acknowledge that lots of our groups did place their project firmly within that realm.
Absolutely. And I do think, oh, sorry, hold on. Matt, did you have your card up? I'll let you jump in first and on you go.
Just a quickie. Actually, you know, the research, it turns people off at times because basically we need to be acknowledged. We need to be accepted as part of the team. We need to be involved. We need to be appreciated. And I think also empowered, encouraged. And that is the reason why, I mean, me and Rachel go back a long way, and Philly, that is the beauty of their conduct and the way they do it. And of course, yourself, Rosie. We are part of the team. And that is the most important thing. And also keeping us in the picture, you know, keeping us up to date and letting us know what's happening and where we are at. And also whether or not our involvement has been fruitful. What has, you know, whether you benefited or not. Either way, we need to know. I spent 5 weeks away, and you know, 90% of the people that I met on this visit do not know that I've got diagnosis of dementia. And you know, I was happy there. I was being myself. I didn't have to take extra time to be careful on things. I was being myself, and I bloody enjoyed it because only me, I was the only one that knew I've got dementia. They didn't. And what also made me happy was the fact that nobody picked it up. And they all treated me as me. And that is the bottom line, really and truly. And that is the backbone of everything. Once we're appreciated, once we're looked at as a person, be it professional or Joe blogs down the road, whatever, that is when life is good quality life for people with a condition.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mac. And I'm really glad you had such a good time. It did make me think also, though, when you were saying there about kind of being able to just crack on with things and not have people say, oh, but you've got dementia, you might not be able to do it. And I think that kind of links into some of the challenges around ethics and this kind of risk averse approach and who's choosing what counts as a risk for somebody with dementia, who's making that decision about what's a risky experiment versus not a risky experiment. For want of a better term, experiment's not always the case. But I also was thinking with everything you've been saying, that I suppose one of the big things I've maybe missed as well that I should have said earlier, so I apologize, is that I think one of the challenges we have in the NHS is when people think of NHS dementia research, they generally think of clinical trials. And in thinking of clinical trials, one of the challenges we have is that the majority of clinical trials are about Alzheimer's disease, which is just one type of dementia. And actually, a lot of the other people like Mac and Winnie, we've talked a lot about the fact that there are different types of dementia that are not being recognised for their individual differences, but also are not suitable for the clinical trials currently available. And I think one of the things we need to do as an NHS organisation in research is make sure that people always feel that there is something for them. If they want to get involved in research in any way, there is research available. And that might not be a clinical trial. And you might not even want to be part of a clinical trial. There's lots of people who don't, and that's a very valid reason. It's very individual. But I think one of the things as partners in research, and I know a huge part of the Dementia Enquirers ethos is saying we will always have opportunities for you. And those opportunities are what will build trust and what will build that feedback into showing how things that people have done have created change. And I think, again, that builds into that relationship, that if you can say, I was involved in this project and I told them that this thing wouldn't work, it was useless, get rid of it, and they got rid of it, and you've seen that, you start to show how your involvement, it reaffirms that trust in them. And a final point, because I'm aware of the time, where we've talked about some of this kind of what terminology we use, whether we use, say, the term dementia, whether Alzheimer's, whether we change those terms, the term patient, person, service user, all that kind of thing. There's also work to be done around the term psychiatry as well, because at the moment, the most common pathway to a diagnosis in the UK is through psychiatry, not through neurology. And there's often a lot of people saying, well, I'd rather it be neurology. That makes more sense. It's a disease of the brain, and that's what happens if you have suspected Parkinson's or motor neuron disease and things like that. But it's also interesting speaking to psychiatrists who say, I wish that our title didn't have that stigma attached, because we've spent a long time learning about dementia. That's actually our thing. That's the thing we know a lot about. But our title puts people off greatly, because again, that trust has been broken along the way, and that stigma attached also impacts the people that take on that role as professionals. And I think in working together and looking at how we do this, we need to treat everyone with the respect that we want to see, and I think this type of work emphasizes that, but also recognize where those different expertise are coming from, and try and look past the label of all these things and go, how do we make sure that we go where's best for us, whether that be psychiatry, whether it be neurology, whether it be clinical trials, whether it be focus groups, all these kind of things. It's about having options that suit with the best expertise, not with the labels. And I think that covers it for everybody. Winnie, is there anything you'd like to add before I shush again?
I think the most important word that was spoken today was something that Mark said, and it was about empowerment. I think that actually sums everything up. That's all, really.
Thank you, Winnie, and thank you very much for joining. Steve, you've got your card up. Do you want to jump in there? I think you're on mute just now, though. There you go.
No, just want to say, times have changed, society has changed. In bygone days, you were diagnosed with dementia, you were given your medicine, you went away, and that was the last you seen or heard with doctors. In this day and age, people are being diagnosed with early onset dementia. People are being diagnosed at a younger age. And we have our faculties where we're not supposed to in certain people's eyes. Now, when we are living well with dementia, we are perfectly entitled to give our view, give our voice, and let's be heard. Now, any research that's done about dementia that doesn't involve people living with dementia, how can that be conclusive? How can that be taken as fact? People need to involve us with all types of research. They need to hear our voice. As I say, the age range now, you're going from sort of 30s and 40s as far as you want to go. And you can pass people in the street, they would not know you had dementia. And until the establishment accepts this fact, we may as well talk to the wall. But we have to keep knocking that wall down and let them know we are here. We have a voice and we want to use it.
Absolutely, Steve, and particularly that, you can be involved in all types of research, and something our plan for this year coming up, the big focus is on how do we incorporate involvement of people with lived experience in clinical research, whether that be in the design and development of clinical research, or in looking at what support system is offered around a lack of clinical research. And that's something that we are starting to have conversations about, which is very exciting. Matt, did I see your card there? Do you want to jump in?
I read somewhere on social media, a person living with dementia is not giving you a hard time. Person living with dementia is having a hard time. And that stuck with me. And it's something that needs to be, I think, put across there so everybody knows. The other thing is, knowing what I know about dementia now, had I known that at 2010, had I met Rachael and Philly and yourself and Steve and Winnie then, I would have carried on work for a start. I would not have locked myself in. I would not have been afraid to go out, and I would have been a different person altogether. So therefore, some of the information needs to be given to us at outset so that we can prepare ourselves. I echo what Steve said, not just give us a diagnosis and say, that's it, there's nothing we can do about it, go and wait for it. That is not good enough. And we are living proof that, we're capable of doing this, that, and the other. And you have got us sitting here doing something that people with degrees do, And I've often said that I hope that we come out with a doctor in front of our name when we finish this.
That can be one of our missions, Mac, is at least an honorary doctorate, because you're right, you're doing so much, but also I think it's a nice way to remind us all how much you will put in to helping inform, educate, and teach others how to improve, and how to, the experiences that you have all shared over the last, let's say, even 10 years in some circumstances.
It's not easy. It takes a lot out of us.
Absolutely.
And once
absolutely.
we're off the Zoom session, I mean, I'll probably just plonk myself on the settee and gone.
Absolutely.
Remain. But we have to be 100% here, because we've got the same cause.
Yes.
And we've got the same goal, and we're trying to do something for the future. So that is what's keeping us motivated.
Yeah.
And that's what's keeping us going.
And I suppose it's recognized you are making a difference. And I want to be very clear on that. The involvement you've all had in Dementia Enquirers and in Partners in Research is making a huge difference. But it's also why I want to make sure that when you guys get involved in things in the future, that mechanism, for whether that be kind of compensation, whether that be additional time, whether that be additional support, we need to make sure that we can put that in place to allow you to have all of your energy to focus on what you want to focus it on, not on the things that actually we can make easier for you around the edges. And the model that, the more we learn from these models of taking on this co-produced approach, the more we can say, right, this is what we need to put in place to make sure that people can attend meetings like this without it taking out too much of your day, or if it's going to take out a lot of your day, what can we do to make your day easier around the edges of that? And that's something that I think, to ethically continue trying to do this more and more, that's some of the things we need to have in place. And that will involve help and support, whether that be financial, whether that be time, resources. And I think this is just the start. It's just the start, but how far we have come in just these last few years is incredible. But that is only because people like yourself have generously given your time and allowed people like me to kind of take the baton with you and knock down some doors and hopefully, widen that public awareness. But it wouldn't work if it was just me going, by the way, I've heard this stuff about dementia, can you learn about it now? It works because all of you have come with me and gone, yep, we'll tell our story, we'll make sure that other people are heard. And I think the long-term legacy of all of that is huge, and I really hope that there's not enough we can do to thank you on that one, but I do think what we can do is constantly show you how that is the case, and how lucky we are to have you, and have organizations like Innovations in Dementia working with us. There's a lot of really exciting things going on, and I'm really proud to be part of it. I'm really proud that we were able to implement a lot of this learning into NHS Scotland. I know that NHS Scotland have benefited massively from it, and will continue to do so. So I think there is a lot of very exciting things coming up, and certainly I don't think you can go backwards. I think once you've learnt this approach, once you've seen how it works, once you've sat in a room with any of you guys, you come away going, yep, that's how I'm going to do things from now on. I cannot do this without you guys. And I hope that's part of how we move forward as well. So I realize we're near the end of the time, so I'll wrap up there. But thank you again to everyone for coming to listen, and I hope the people who are listening to the recording enjoy it too. And if they would like any more information, we can send that on in various ways. Rachel will be making packs for a while to come.